This episode is brought to you by Christendom, a big tent platform for Catholic content creators. Say goodbye to endlessly browsing for Catholic content. At Christendom, we make it simple to follow, share, and save your favorite creators' content. Join our community at christendom.app. It's free.
Hello, everybody. I am John Allen, and this is Last Week in the Church, the show where we harvest the rich and abundant fruits of the last week of journalism on the Vatican and the global Catholic Church beat. Here's what's on the menu for this week. We begin with pressing the Pope. Pope Francis has returned from a weekend outing to Luxembourg and Belgium, and in accord with predictions, Belgium proved to be a bit of a tough room. For Pope Francis, he drew blowback on multiple fronts, from the sex abuse crisis to the inclusion of LGBTQ plus Catholics. But above all, it was his rhetoric on women that stirred controversy. We'll explain what the Pope said, how people reacted to it, and how Francis kind of doubled down on it all in his airborne press conference on the way back to Rome. Second, this week, we've got It's Back! The curtain is coming up today on the second and final edition of the Pope's Synod of Bishops on Synodality. We will explain potentially what to expect, what not to expect, and sort of step through the agenda for what's going to happen on what promises to be a fairly action-packed month of October here in Rome. Third up this week, we have Journalistic Malpractice Part 1. So, last week, Pope Francis approved the expulsions of 10 members of a controversial lay movement in Peru called the Sodality of Christian Life, including one who has been sanctioned for the relatively novel offense of journalistic malpractice. We'll explain why that is both an important and also potentially ambivalent precedent. Break it all down for you. And then, Journalistic Malpractice Part 2. It turns out that some, including the guy who has just been sanctioned, have accused us at Crux of playing fast and loose with the rules of good journalistic tradecraft. I generally don't like talking about ourselves, but in this case, I will make a brief exception to explain what's truly going on. All that and more is waiting for you on this edition of Last Week in the Church. So please do not touch that dial, do not get out of your seat, do not abandon your full upright and locked position, because we will be right back. All right, everybody, welcome back. Happy Tuesday to you. Happy Tuesday, October 1st, 2024. As we speak today, the 368 participants in the Synod of Bishops on Synodality are wrapping up day 2 of a 2-day spiritual retreat before the curtain actually opens tomorrow morning on Wednesday. We'll come to what they're going to be up to in just a moment. But we begin this week with pressing the Pope. So Pope Francis just completed a September 26th to the 29th outing to Luxembourg, where he basically just got a cup of coffee. He wasn't there for even a full day. It was just a few hours. And then spent 3 days in Belgium, in part to celebrate the 600th anniversary of the 2 principal Catholic universities in Belgium, one the Dutch-speaking University of Leuven, the other the French-speaking University of Louvain. Now, in the run-up to this trip, many of us who are professional Vatican watchers had predicted that this might be a bit of a troubled outing for Pope Francis. I mean, after all, Belgium is a nation that has been gripped by one of the worst sexual abuse crises in Western Europe. It is also one of the most thoroughly secular societies on earth, where the Catholic Church's positions on issues such as women and gay rights, abortion, birth control, divorce, euthanasia, so on, often can be deeply unpopular. And so the forecast had kind of been for, turbulence. Now, to my amazement, we were actually right. Like normally when we issue these kind of predictions, the sun comes out, the sky turns blue, everybody has a great time. and our kind of Sturm und Drang treatment of the subject ends up looking fairly silly. But in this instance, not so. From the moment the Pope touched down in Belgium, I mean, there was a warm welcome, let us be clear. Officially, the government of Belgium rolled out the red carpet for the Pope. He was welcomed by the King and Queen, by the Prime Minister, and so on. And, there were certainly signs of grassroots Catholic enthusiasm as the Pope moved around. But nevertheless, from the very beginning, there was also pushback, there was blowback, there was tension, there was angst. Okay, it began, for instance, when the Pope met the Prime Minister of Belgium, Alexander de Crux, who used the occasion of that meeting, that is the Prime Minister, to issue a kind of public reprimand of Pope Francis and the Catholic Church for the way it has handled the sexual abuse scandals. And let us remember that Belgium is a place where the legacy of those scandals is particularly keenly felt. Perhaps the most notorious case was of former bishop and now former priest Roger Wangelhui, who was laicized, but somewhat belatedly, after accusations of abuse first surfaced in 2010. Wangelhui eventually acknowledged several acts of abuse, including some against his own nephews. And not only that would be bad enough, of course, but recordings also came to light in which the former Archbishop of Brussels, Cardinal Godfrey Danneels, appeared to be trying to persuade one of those nephews not to go public. This created impressions of a kind of systematic cover-up. And ever since, the church in Belgium has been trying to dig out from under all of this. And the Pope certainly got an earful about it. And let me just say, normally, when a head of government welcomes a pope to the country, it is a very pro forma, feel-good sort of address. Normally, it's, Holy Father, you're doing us great honor by this visit. Let me extol the greatness of our country to you. We are rich in diversity and proud on our heritage and blah, blah, blah. And we're thrilled you're here. Please have a great time. Peace out. And that's usually what it amounts to. So the idea that a head of government would actually use such a platform to give the Pope a kind of public scolding, this is not something that happens every day. But it actually got worse from there. That was Thursday. Then on Friday, the Pope went to the Catholic University of Leuven to give an address to professors and faculty and students and so on. And among other things, he dwelt at some length on the role of women both in society and the church, and, said many of the things he always says about how important women are, their inherent dignity, their equality with men, and so on. But he also used a phrase in which he said that, the true feminine genius, right, true femininity, he said, is not a product of ideology or consensus, but of a law written upon our hearts. In other words, what he was saying is that male-female differences are not simply culturally determined, but they're also a result of, in essence, natural law. That is, they're given in nature. That, of course, runs contrary to the dogma in sort of secular milieu these days, particularly, the faculty lounges of elite secular universities. And so it was that really only moments after Francis finished speaking on Friday, the University of Leuven put out a statement of protest, in effect saying we have to register our strong disagreement with what the Pope said about women, which they referred to as deterministic and reductive. And there were other women who were present in the room who also registered their dissent. Flash forward to Sunday, when the Pope is celebrating an open-air mass at King Baudouin Stadium in Brussels. There were women dressed all in white who were standing in a kind of silent protest against the exclusion of women from the priesthood in the Catholic Church. Another reminder of the tensions surrounding the issue of women during the Pope's visit. So, in the press conference on the papal plan on the way back, Francis was asked about all of this. And rather than seeming contrite, the Pope, if I'm going to use my wife's verbiage, she said he got a little sassy. Actually got his back up a little bit and said, all of this is essentially ridiculous. He called it the product of an exaggerated feminism and went on to reiterate how committed he is to male-female equality and so on, and sort of dismissed the whole thing. But then, in a way, almost seemed to add new fuel to the fire later in the press conference when he was asked a question about his support for a canonization cause for King Baudouin of Belgium. And he referred to the courage that King Baudouin showed in 1990 when he resigned his office for a day rather than sign a measure that legalized abortion in Belgium, saying in conscience he could not do that. And the Pope, in praising his courage, said, that took a politician with pants. In other words, equating pants, the quintessential male garment, with courage. Okay? I mean, in English, we talk about who wears the pants around here, right? It was sort of the equivalent of that. Now, you might think of that as a toss-away phrase, except in the context when the Pope is taking a drubbing for, his rhetoric on women to invoke a kind of superannuated stereotype equating men with courage, you can understand why some people just were a little surprised by that. In any event, I think the bottom line is this. What it shows, among other things, is the difference between Catholic and secular standards of what counts as progressivism. By any reasonable Catholic standard, Pope Francis is a progressive. His promotion of women, his flexibility when it comes to traditional dogmatic points, his promotion of bishops and other figures in the church who would be seen as more progressive in their orientation, his, at times, hostility, or at least the cold shoulder he shows to traditionalist Catholics, to the Latin Mass, and so on. I mean, all of that, by Catholic standards, you've got to say, he's more liberal than, say, John Paul II or Benedict XVI, no doubt. But in a secular milieu, right, where being liberal means you are pro-abortion rights, you are pro-gay marriage, you reject the idea of gender having any biological component at all, and all of that, even somebody such as Pope Francis, in that context, is going to profile as somewhat conservative, right? I think that should be the takeaway. The other takeaway is this is not a pope at times who brooks criticism particularly well. He's not the kind of guy who was going to say, gosh, you know what, you're right, I kind of blew it in that speech on Friday, and I shouldn't have said that, or I should have added this, or whatever. You confront him with criticism, and his initial instinct is to sort of get his back up and double down. All right, move on to point 2 this week. It's back. So after 3 years and much dialogue, much debate, and at times much division, the long-running Synod of Bishops on Synodality will reach its denouement. How's that for rolling out words that start with D? By the way, dumbfounding. Wouldn't you agree? In any event, the conclusion of the Synod of Bishops on Synodality unfolds this month in Rome. As I mentioned at the top of the show, participants in the Synod are currently experiencing a 2-day spiritual retreat. Then the curtain on the meat of the Synod goes up on Wednesday. Things begin with a papal mass in the morning, and then the first working session of the Synod in the afternoon. Now, in some ways, many observers regard all of this as a somewhat anticlimactic exercise. There had been expectations that there would be kind of high-profile seismic clashes during the Synod over issues such as the blessing of same-sex unions or the ordination of women to the diaconate. But in various ways, Pope Francis has kind of taken those questions off the table. He's already approved a document giving cautious support for blessings of persons involved in same-sex unions. He has said no to the female diaconate, and in terms of further discussion, he has assigned them to these 10 working groups that are going to continue to meet after the Synod is over. So nobody is really expecting anything dramatic on either of those issues, or really anything else, frankly, to come out of this assembly. In other words, this is much more about the journey than the destination. 360 participants in the synod, of whom 292 are bishops. The rest, 96, are priests, deacons, male and female religious, and also male and female laity. 16 ecumenical delegates this time, as opposed to 12 last time. New representatives from the Syriac Orthodox Church and from the Lutheran World Federation. Still, however, nobody from the Russian Orthodox Church, that is the Patriarchate of Moscow. And, the same rules are going to apply as last time, which is those participants have been told not to talk about the inner workings of the synod with the press or with anybody else. There will, however, be 4 public events, 2 on, if I'm not wrong, 2 on the 9th of October and 2 on the 16th. They're going to be held at the Augustinian and the Jesuit headquarters, both in the immediate environs of St. Peter's Square, on topics related to the synod. So I guess we'll be able to wet our beaks a little bit in terms of the kinds of things being talked about. There will also be an ecumenical prayer service on October 11th and a canonization of 14 saints, including 11 19th century Christian martyrs in Syria, which will take place on October 20th. So lots of activity. Whether this is all sound and fury signifying relatively little, or whether there could still be a bolt from the blue, that, of course, remains to be determined. We will have full coverage of the Synod of Bishops on synodality in its concluding act on the Crux site. All right, we segue now to journalistic malpractice, part 1. So last week, Pope Francis approved the expulsions of 10 members of the Sodalitium Christianae Vitae, the Sodality of Christian Life, which is a lay movement that was founded in Peru and which, for the last several years, has been surrounded by accusations of various forms of abuse, including sexual abuse, but also abuse of power, abuse of conscience. There are also accusations of financial irregularities. There has been a Vatican investigation underway for some months now. Its first concrete result was the expulsion of the founder of the Sodalitium, Peruvian layman Luis Fernando Figari, a few weeks ago. And now we have the expulsions of these 10 members. The investigation is ongoing, so there could still be other expulsions and other results somewhere down the line. But for now, what is interesting about these 10 people who were expelled is that one of them has been charged with what we might loosely call journalistic malpractice. We're talking about a layman by the name of Alejandro Bermudez, divides his time between Peru and the United States, who has been an extraordinarily prominent figure in Catholic journalism, really for the last quarter century. He was at one point the director of Prensa, a news agency in Spanish, and also the Catholic News Agency in English, which has become the sort of official news agency of EWTN and its media empire. Now, Bermudez operates more or less independently, maintains a very active social media profile, and so on. Let me disclose, I have met Bermudez several times over the years. When I used to live in Denver, I at one point was part of a supper club with Archbishop Charles Chaput that Bermudez was also at, but that hardly makes me unique. If you've been involved in Catholic journalism in either English or Spanish for the last 25 years, you certainly will have crossed paths with Bermudez at one point or another, probably more than once. All right. So the charge is that Bermudez uses his high media profile to foster division and acrimony rather than to build up ecclesiastical communion. The investigation pointed to the way that, well, I mean, to put it politely, or maybe euphemistically, he can sometimes be a little pugnacious in the way he presents himself in public and the way he talks about his perceived enemies. I mean, just the other day, he referred to a fellow journalist as, and I'm quoting here, a weasel, a coward, and a disgrace. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is one of the more mild things he sometimes has to say about people. So that was one. There are also charges that he engaged in suspect journalistic practices such as the invasion of privacy and so on. This is believed to be the first time the Vatican has imposed an ecclesiastical sanction on someone for their practice of journalism, for their journalistic activity. Okay? So it therefore is precedent setting, and it's a precedent that I think deserves to be examined. Let me tell you why I'm a bit ambivalent about the whole thing. On the one hand, the journalist in me does not like the idea of punishing journalists for what we write or say, for three reasons. One, the obvious freedom of the press concern. Two, there but for the grace of God. That is, today they're using this tool against Bermudez, but what's to prevent, when the wheels turn in the future, what's to prevent someone from using the same measure against the likes of me? And third, and perhaps most importantly, in my experience, when authority tries to clamp down on a journalist, particularly one who's kind of a pundit, it has the opposite effect of what was intended. You're trying to silence them. What you actually do is turn them into a martyr and amplify their voice and only make things worse. Okay? So generally, my counsel in these situations is, if you don't like what somebody has to say, don't try to muzzle them. Just ignore them. Because for this kind of personality that craves attention the way junkies crave their next fix, ignoring them is the worst thing you could possibly do. On the other hand, it's important to note that this sanction wasn't really imposed upon Bermudez as a journalist, okay? But instead, it was imposed upon him as a consecrated member of a papally recognized Catholic movement. In other words, the concern here is that without doing something, the perception could have been that his journalistic activity was being carried out with the blessing of the church. And in effect, what the Vatican has said with this sanction is not that you can't be a journalist, because that's not in their power to control, okay? What they have said is, you can't be a journalist in our name, okay? It's a sort of not in our name exercise, right? Saying that, if you were going to conduct yourself in public in this way, we want to disassociate ourselves from it. And look, whether that is going to work either in terms of changing this particular individual's way of engaging issues or the broader media climate, I don't know. What I do know is that we live in a time in which the media space is dominated by vitriol, acrimony, and character assassination masquerading as journalism. And if this measure serves as a wake-up call, then I would suggest it will have accomplished some good purpose, even though I have some trepidations about how it might be used down the line, because the fear, of course, is that it could turn into a tool for officialdom simply to try to punish speech with which it disagrees. That would be good for nobody. So here's hoping that this sanction is used sparingly and with great caution. Let's also hope it has the effect for which it was intended, which is causing us all to rethink a kind of toxic media environment in which we are all complicit in creating, by the way. Let's hope it has that effect and not a kind of chilling effect on the freedom of the press that is vital for any society, including the Society of the Catholic Church. All right, finally, this week, we come to Freedom of the Press Part 2. And let me say, I am about to violate one of my own personal rules, because one of my own personal rules is I never talk about my own journalistic activity or Crux's journalistic activity in public. I figure we have our word when we publish or broadcast our stories. After that, it's up to other people to comment on them. If you notice, when people go out in public and they criticize Crux's coverage for one reason or another, we never respond to it, ever. It's a rule of fate, right? Because, first of all, we don't want to be drawn into these public crossfires anyway, but just in general, I do not think reporters should inject themselves into the stories that they cover. I think the focus should be on the report, not the reporter. Given all of that, however, I cannot avoid the fact that of late there have been some public criticism of Crux's coverage of the story involving the sodality of Christian life, including some from Alejandro Bermudez himself. And so I think it's probably incumbent upon me to say something briefly about it, because, I mean, the risk is otherwise, if I don't, then my silence might be construed as consent, right? So here goes. One criticism that has been made is that our coverage has been almost entirely carried out by my wife, Elise Ann Allen, who is a former, well, she was in discernment with a women's group associated with the sodality. She was never formally a member, but she was discerning a path towards membership. So she had a tie to the organization. That she is a former employee of the Catholic News Agency during the time when Bermudez was the director of that agency, and also that she has given testimony as part of the Vatican investigation. Let me just stipulate from the outset, all of that is completely true. We've disclosed it before. I disclosed it again this past Sunday in my weekly column, and I'm disclosing it to you again here right now. And it is perfectly reasonable, I think, to ask the question, does that create a conflict of interest? But let me also point out that there is no hard and fast rule in journalism that says that just because you were once a member of a group or connected to it in some way, that for the rest of your life, you can never report on it. I mean, were that the standard, Neil Sheehan would never have covered the war in Vietnam because he was once a member of the United States Army. I mean, sometimes that kind of background gives you a depth of understanding that simply can't be harvested in any other fashion. And in any event, what I would insist is that the judgment about the quality of reporting should be based on the reporting itself and not on the presumed biases of the reporter. In other words, look at Crux's coverage and ask yourself, does it come off as fair? Does it come off as balanced? Does it come off as informed? Does it come off as responsible? Does it come off as contextualized? And if the answer to those questions are yes, and by the way, I am personally confident that that is the correct answer, then, Elise's background fades into irrelevance, all right? In other words, don't shoot the messenger. Judge the work on its own merits, not on the presumed, biographical details of the person presenting that report. All right. Now, the second accusation that has been leveled is that Elise is somehow complicit in something shady because she often has information that other people don't. That is, she has seemingly very well-placed sources. First of all, I would just like to note the irony of one journalist complaining that another journalist's sources are too good. Okay? I mean, that's like saying Usain Bolt, that's like saying some guy who competed in the 100 meters at the Olympics is complaining that Usain Bolt is just too fast, right? I mean, it's a ridiculous objection on the surface of it, but more to the point, let me just say this, without violating any confidences. I can say I have watched Elise work this story for months. Okay, she invests hours every day, practically, in this story. She has cultivated a network of sources in Rome, in Peru, and in multiple other parts of the world that is longer than my arm. I mean, it is a veritable cornucopia of contacts that she has put together. And therefore, the fact that she often knows things other people don't, in itself, says absolutely nothing about where she acquired that information. The suggestion here being that somebody in the Vatican who's involved in the investigation is leaking. There is absolutely no evidence of that. And conclusions to the contrary, on the basis of information Elise has published, they're simply speculative. And at times, that speculation may be a little malicious. Last thought. In one recent social media post, Bermudez described my 2020 wedding to Elise as surprising. I don't know what he meant, but let me just say, there is a sense in which I am in full agreement. To quote C.S. Lewis, I was that day in 2020, and I have remained every day since profoundly surprised by joy. All right, that is our show for this week. Thank you for being with us. As ever, you can find full coverage of all these stories on the Crux site, that is cruxnow.com. We will be back here next week, same bat time, same bat channel, with the latest and greatest on the Vatican and the global church. So be with us then. In the meantime, have a fantastic and blessed week. Stay safe, stay healthy, and we will talk to you again very soon.